Hello everyone and welcome to this recorded session which goes into looking into a little bit more depth about interviews which you might be using or considering to use for your research project. The aim of the session is to give you some insight and some guidance into the different forms of interviews, because there are different forms of interviewing that you can use, and obviously you need to be able to be quite particular in your research project about what you're doing. I'll be giving you some guidance on the questioning and the types of questioning that you can put together. Again, these are all the types of things you can write about within your research methods section for your research project. We'll also be looking at some of the pitfalls of interviewing, some of the things you have to prepare for and avoid and to watch out for when you are preparing for an interview. Interviews sound straightforward, but actually they can be things you need to avoid, there can be biases you need to consider, and we'll be considering them in this session. We'll also be looking at focus groups and how focus groups relate to interviews and where they're particularly useful to be used in research. So you might want to consider focus groups as well, or discount them as part of this recorded session. So we'll start off with interviews, and well, interview's an interview. I think you probably all know what an interview is. A definition: an interview is a purposeful discussion between two or more people. Usually an interview in a research sense, strictly, is between the interviewer and the interviewee. When we're looking at focus groups, that's between an interviewer and a number of interviewees. So a focus group is just simply an interview with many people present in terms of who you're interviewing. There's a lot of people that you're interviewing in one room. And the point of a focus group is you want them to discuss between them the question that you're giving them, so you can understand how they're thinking, the debates that are coming across. In an actual interview, it's more to do with one interviewer, which will be you, maybe as the researcher, and you're interviewing one other person. That's the standard format. So we'll consider focus groups at the end of the session, but we'll concentrate on the main kind of methodology that many of you might be using, which is the interview. And there are many different types, as I've said before. So you've got structured interviews, semi-structured interviews, unstructured interviews, and as I say, there's this one-to-many interview, which is actually a focus group. Okay, one being the interviewer, many being the number of people in the focus group. So we'll look at that at the end. It's very important to consider whether interviewing is appropriate for your research. Remember, as I said before in these recorded sessions, it's very important to select the research method that is useful or most appropriate to your research objectives, but also remember when you started off on this journey, this research journey, you defined a problem, an opportunity, or an issue, a very practical problem, opportunity, issue that an organization is facing, or a consumer's facing, or a manager's facing, or whoever it may be. There's something practical on the ground, at the coalface, at grassroots, that someone is having an issue with, or there's an opportunity they don't know how to approach, or a problem they need to solve. Remember, that's the focus of your research. That seems a long way off when you get into more depth in terms of literature reviews and methodologies. Always go back to that, because that's what you're trying to solve, that's what you're trying to achieve. And when you're selecting your research methods, whether it be interview or not, you've got to say why the method you're chosen is the most appropriate, and it will give me the data that helps me solve this problem, helps me with this issue, or helps me with this opportunity that I've originally told you about. So the first thing is to consider whether interview is appropriate and why it's appropriate. Okay, and of course, by doing that, we can get an insight. When we're doing our literature reviews, we're looking at other people's research in the area, and we're considering how they're researching. Because if they're researching a lot with interviews, that's giving us an indication that interviews are probably quite useful here. Because remember, those papers that you're reading, the theories that you're reading, and how the researchers have researched those theories and come up with those theories, they've had to go through the same process that you're going through. They're going through selecting methods, choosing methods, and justifying why that method is important. So it's the same process, but at a different level. Okay. Now, one way we can justify our research method is by looking at the disadvantages of all the other research methods. So even though you might be listening to this and think, no, interview is not for me, it might be as you go through this recorded session, you think, why interview is not for me? Because that could be a way of saying, right, interview is not for me, and that's partly a way of justifying why you're choosing another technique, maybe observation. So you shouldn't just skip these sessions. Interviews are good at when you're trying to get some depth and understanding of what's happening and why it's happening, because you can ask people and probe people on what actually what's happening or what they understand to be happening in the situation. So it's great for that kind of understanding type questions, but also it's very good for just understanding, the what type questions. What has happened here. A Blockbuster has gone bust. What actually happened? If you're interviewing an employee or interviewing a manager, tell me what you saw happen and what actually was happening behind the scenes. It's just understanding the what type questions. So why and what, are the good kind of research issues that you can be looking at and the research questions you could be considering here. So again, spend a few minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, pause the recording, and consider your research topic, consider your aims and objectives, and also consider your original problem, opportunity, and issue, and consider whether interviewing, trying to get understanding of what's happening or what has happened, is important, or trying to get someone's opinion on something is where we would use an interview. Think about whether interview is useful here in your problem. If it is, great, fantastic. But explain why. Now, and that's important, because if you spend a bit of time now trying to explain why interviewing could be important to your research topic, then you're starting to put together your methodology. You're starting to actually think about the arguments you're going to pose in your research methods. So spend 5-10 minutes now. If you don't want to, then keep going. But it's up to you. So 5-10 minutes, have a go. Okay, so let's for argument's sake think that interviewing is appropriate to our research project, because I want to understand what managers were thinking at the time when they went into the Indian market, and of course in this context the Indian market went bust, for example. Okay, so I'm set on an interview, but there are many different types of interviews that we need to consider, and that's what we're going to look at now. You remember us saying there was something called a structured interview. Well, a structured interview actually actually fits in with the more deductive approach to research. The deductive approach is this almost more scientific approach, where we're just trying to understand the trends that are happening, or the patterns that are happening. We're not trying to explain why, we're just trying to understand what actually happened, the facts of the situation. And the structured interviews is much more of this deductive approach. And here the interviewer has a standard set of questions. It's very rigid, and that fits again with the deductive approach. Very rigid, standard set of questions, and basically the interviewer reads out each question in a very objective manner. Now, the reason they do that is basically to remove what we call interview bias. So we don't persuade the interviewee to answer the question in a certain way. So we are very objective, and of course we record the response of what they said, and that's it. We don't show any emotion, and we just move on to the next question. The questions are read out exactly as they've been written. There's no deviation to them. Now, they do that as well because if you're interviewing several people, they all get the exactly same question delivered in the exactly same way. And again, that tries to avoid any variance or bias or any form of persuasion that they answer the question in a certain way. You even try, if you read about structured interviews, they even try to use the same tone of voice and the way the question is delivered, and of course the same kind of setting to avoid any bias whatsoever. So you can see it's very much quite a controlled way of conducting an interview. It can be a little unsettling for an interviewee. And this kind of structured interviews is maybe much more, you can imagine the police using it, you can imagine investigators using it, where they're very straight-faced, they're very, very controlled, and there's no emotion, and they're just simply asking you a question and very objectively, and they're wanting a response. And it's very unsettling, I think, but who's to say? It's what the usefulness of this kind of interview is to try to understand what happened, the trends, what actually happened, the facts of the situation. It's not generally a why type questioning purpose, not why does this happen, but what actually happened here. Tell me the facts of the situation. What happened in 1980? So it's more understanding what actually happened, but not the why questions of what actually happened. And here's an example here. So we could have this is a structured interview question. Which services would you like to see? So this could be you're researching opportunities for a hotel, and the question is which services would you like to see? And there's a range of options: bed making, laundry, ironing, cleaning, other, and of course you tick a box and you write something in the other. So again, very straightforward, very objective, very simple type of interviewing process. But great if you just want to understand, 90% of people questioned wanting to see a laundry service in the hotel. Fantastic. And of course, your recommendations can spin off that. So, fairly good. But if you want to understand why something's happening or why something's going on, or you want to understand people's opinions on something, then you want to be looking at more of a semi-structured interviewing type of technique. This is much more flexible, not as rigid. It's more of a conversation. There's no real set questions. There's more themes. What I mean by themes is you might have some questions around certain topics, or you might just have a list of topics that you have, and you have questions around them. So it is much more of a conversation, and it's fine to add questions into the conversations if you want to get more meaning. So the structured interview wouldn't allow that. It's just these are 10 questions. These are just answer these, tick this box, and that's it. So fine for understanding the bare bones of the facts of the situation, but here we're trying to get more insight and more depth of what people feel and what people are thinking, and why something happened perhaps, and their opinions. So this is why it's much more of a conversation, and you can actually steer, the interviewee can steer the conversation into quite interesting things. So we do have it's semi-structured because we may have a list of certain type of questions or themes that we have that we want to ask and we want to know about. But it is a form of exploratory research where we're trying to understand why people think in such a way, why they have such opinions, or why something happens. So we're just trying to get more insight and depth. And this one links structured interviews links much more to the deductive way of approach to research. Semi-structured interviews links to inductive research, because it's trying to understand the whys of the world. It's trying to understand why this happened. What was your opinion on this? It's trying to get this background, kind of what's actually happened here. So again, semi-structured interviews, that is probably one of the most common interviews that happens in business research. Structured interviews are also very common. They are used to help understand what a large number of people think. The good thing about semi-structured interviews is you can do these with a clipboard in the street for 100 people, and it will take you a day. Whereas semi-structured interviews, it's sitting down with someone and spending time with them. So you're limited in the amount of people you can interview. I mean, this is an example of a question from a semi-structured interview. So, what do you like about your job? Again, very open, and let them talk about it, and let them actually respond to that question. It's not about having a trend here. It's just what do you like, and there'll be all sorts of things come out of this. One of the downsides of a semi-structured interview, there could be a lot to record in terms of the conversation, in terms of the responses to your questions. So that's one of the downsides, but you tend to get a good understanding of what's actually happening, or what people think, or what their opinions will be. And then we've got the unstructured interview. Now, unstructured interviews are even more informal than semi-structured interviews, and sometimes they're called in-depth interviews. So, and in here, whereas in semi-structured interviews we had that list of themes, or we had a list of tentative questions, but we could ask more questions and add questions to the situation when we were interviewing the person. In an unstructured interview, we may not have a list of questions at all. It may be it's just a conversation, and we strike off the conversation with stuff we're interested in, what we are talking about with our research. Now, that is really open. Now, my recommendation is you at least have on a sheet of paper a list of kind of themes and topics you want to ask about, which it is much more a bit more semi-structured, but I think you need to have a little bit of structure there, and that's why I say That's why I say the semi-structured interview is probably the most common interview ever used in business research. This one is completely flexible. You can use this unstructured interview, or sometimes called an in-depth interview, kind of on the cuff. So if you're for example, remember we've been talking about action research. Remember, action research is research where you're working in a situation, you're taking action. In other words, you're making decisions, you're helping with what that company's doing. And of course, as part of your work, as part of your action research, as part of your job, whatever you're doing, you could be talking to someone one day. It just happens that you met them in the corridor, and you want to ask them. You thought, oh, I'm going to ask them about this, that, and the other. Well, that would be described as an in-depth interview, or or an unstructured interview, where it kind of happened, and you had these topics, so you were particularly interested in these things, so you could make a decision in your action research. Remember the action research cycles where we had planning, acting, and observing, and reflecting on what we did. Of course, understanding what we should do in terms of planning, we might want to interview people and get some more information. So this happens, can happen great in kind of observational research, participant observational research, and even action research. It's not one that you would set about in terms of meeting with someone to have a unstructured interview. It's used in many of those situations where you like observational, participant research, or action research. The one where you're actually calling someone up, saying, "Look, can I interview you?" That's more of a semi-structured. Okay, the clipboard job in the street is much more of a structured interview. Okay, where you have a list of questions, you tick the boxes, you do it for as many people as you can. So bear that in mind when you choose these things. So pause for a little bit, and this is important, because if you are using interviews, you need to start thinking about which interview you're going to use. Are you trying to understand the general trends of a situation, which is more the structured interview? Okay. Are you trying to get a bit more in depth? Are you going to be trying to interview managers, call them up and get an appointment and interview them, which is more of a semi-structured interview, and you have a list of questions and themes that you're going to ask them, and you can ask more questions when you're doing the interview if something is particularly interesting to your topic? Or is it going to be in-depth interviews or unstructured interviews, which is used as part of a participant observational research, where you're observing a company, you're working for that company, or participating in that company, and as part of that process, you may be interviewing managers and employees to understand what's going on a bit more. So have a think about that. Have a think, if you are using interviews, which interview is going to be the most appropriate. And if you aren't going to, or you don't think you're going to be using interviews, then think about why you're not going to be using interviews. How does this relate? In other words, how does this relate back to your problem, opportunity, or issue? Okay. If you're not going to use interviews, say why. Justify why they're not appropriate, because that will help you justify why you're going to use a different research technique. So pause for 5-10 minutes and try to brainstorm some arguments about justifying which interviews you're going to use, which interview technique you're going to use, or justifying why you're not going to use these interview techniques. Moving on, we're going to now look at some issues. If you are using interviews, we're going to look at some issues to do with interviewing as part of a research project. And these issues are data quality, preparation and interviewing skills and competencies, the types of questions you can put together, of course, and recording interviews, because you're all going to have to record an interview if you are doing them, and transcribe them. So I'll take you through that process as well. So in terms of data quality, one of the biggest things we need to be very concerned about is avoiding interview bias. Okay, now this is where the comments, the tone, or the non-verbal behaviour of the interviewer creates bias in a way that the interviewee responds to questions in a different way. So what we're doing here is that the interviewers may be making gestures, and sometimes you don't know you're doing it. You might be nodding your head in agreement, and actually subconsciously that might be affecting the interviewee's response to the question. So you've got to be careful here. So, and when we're talking about data quality and we're talking about interviewer bias, we can write into our method section how we try to avoid it. So we are basically trying to avoid imposing our own beliefs in the questions asked. So we need to be careful about how we pose the questions, so that the questions are objective and they're not leading people in a certain way. And of course, what I would also consider is piloting your interview with a friend. So interview them and ask them their feedback. And again, you can write into your research project that you piloted it, you got some feedback, and it came back that actually I was nodding my head in agreement, which kind of spurred me on, or I was raising my eyebrows almost in disagreement. You've got to avoid all that kind of behavior, and you've also got to avoid, when you're writing your questions, you don't have leading questions, that your questions do not lead the interviewee into a certain way. So try to have the questions very objective, and of course run a pilot. In terms of preparing for an interview, knowledge is important. Now, the last thing in the world you want to do is go to an interview unprepared. If you're interviewing someone, especially someone who's very short on time, if you're going to interview them, you have to be prepared, because if you ask them stupid questions, they're going to be frustrated. They just want to get rid of you quickly. Okay, so be prepared. Make sure you know what you're talking about. Make sure you're clear on what you're talking about. And again, if you do a pilot with a friend, a partner, or your mom or dad, they will actually think, actually, you're not that prepared, are you? Because, they will tell you this. And of course, you can prepare yourself. So it isn't about quickly calling someone up and says, can I interview you? And turning up and doing it. It's a bit more of a lengthy process. So you just need to be careful here, because, if you don't come prepared, the interviewer will just think it's a waste of time, just give you short answers and want to get rid of you quickly. Sometimes it's good to send some information to the person you're interviewing. So we can supply the themes. Remember that in the semi-structured interview, we have these themes, or these kind of tentative questions we're going to be looking at. Well, you can send them, because they can have a think about them before the interview, and that could give you some more depth. So it will give them a little bit more insight into what you're doing in the interview, and also it gives them a little time to prepare, so they can respond to your questions fully. So that's quite good for semi-structured interviews. In terms of the themes and the questions that you ask, this all relates, and what I would recommend for a very good research project is that if you're doing a questionnaire, or if you're doing an interview, you should justify the questions you're asking. Basically, say why you're asking question 1, why are you asking question 2, why are you asking question 3, what are you aiming to get out of it, why is that question important. So the questions you ask should be justified, and the way you justify them is, it could be based on your research problem, opportunity, or issue, because that's what you're trying to find out, or it could be something in the literature has spurred on that they missed out asking this, and you think it's important to your problem, an issue, and opportunity, so therefore you're justifying that question that way. So every question you ask in an interview needs to be justified. Why are you asking this? Because a lot of students just put interviews, I'm going to ask them if they're male or female. Well, great, but then when it comes to their results, they don't even use that data. So they don't think through, why am I using this question, why am I asking it in relation to what I'm set out to try and do in terms of the research objectives, the research problem, opportunity, or issue that you've originally defined. Location can be an influence. So you are recording these things. You do have to record your interviews, especially semi-structured and in-depth interviews. Ideal to record them. In terms of structured interviews, remember I said that's the more clipboard one, where you're catching people in the street and you're asking them the question and you tick in a box or putting down a very brief response. You don't need to record them, because you're recording it in hard copy. You're actually ticking the boxes and put it onto a sheet. In terms of semi-structured and in-depth interviews, you definitely need to be recorded with a dictaphone and transcribed. Transcribes means you need to write them up. So you play it back and you write it word for word, and you put that in your appendices. You can pay people to do that, because it is a very time-consuming process, but that's totally up to you. But you just need to be transcribed. The location can be important because of noise, and sometimes it's fear. I mean, it depends on your project, but if you're interviewing someone and they may be fearful, and in other words, they might think, well, is he going to tell my manager about this? So, doing it in the manager's office might not be the best idea. So thinking about the location again could be important, just to to ease people sometimes. And of course, you don't want to influence the responses, because that's going back to the bias situation. An appearance, dress in a similar style. Many students have turned up shorts and t-shirts to an interview in a company, a big company, where they're all suited up and booted, and of course it looks bad, and it also gives them an impression that you're not very serious. And of course, they just want to get rid of you quickly. They give you one-word answers, and that's going to be bad for your research, because it's going to reflect in your mark. Because it's going to show that, well, actually, that there's nothing much to this interview, and the examiner will be asking questions why, of course. So adopting a similar style to whoever you're interviewing. If you're interviewing skaters and skateboarders, and they've got their boardies on and they've got their trainers on, fine, you dress like them, not a problem. You wouldn't dress in a suit for them, because that would put them off. So it's just basically adopting a similar style. In terms of how you structure your interviewing questions, the opening comments can be quite important. So and they can have a significant impact. What you're trying to do is instill credibility and professionalism in whoever you're interviewing. So again, it has to be in relation to whoever you're interviewing. So if it is a business person, obviously shaking hands, being professional is really important. If you're interviewing like I say, skateboarders or surfers, there'll be a different conduct there. You need to act in a slightly different way. You wouldn't interview them in a suit in a suit, for example, because that would put them off. So you need to be at their level. Really important if you're interviewing managers, really, because they don't want to waste their time. In the first few minutes, explain the purpose of the research and what it's doing, why it's so important. And remember, you should have done that, because you should have justified what your research topic is in the first place. So that's important. Try to settle any uncertainties about sharing information. So confidentiality, they don't have to have their name on it. They don't have to have their position or where they're from. They could just be called interviewee A from company B, and you can give some vague descriptions of that if they want. Sometimes it's depending on the topic. Sometimes it's essential. They don't want that to be shared out. So settle their ease there, so they can share their information freely, in the sense that they won't be, there's no problems in terms of confidentiality. In terms of confidentiality, the project, it will be completely confidential. You should mark it as confidential, private and confidential. It will never go any further than the examiners. Okay, so that's very important. So please mark it like that, and don't be afraid that it will be going further, because it won't. And of course, make it an open, relaxed, and friendly atmosphere, because that's important to get people to share their information and to share a lot of knowledge with you that you can be very useful for your research. Your behaviour as the interviewer can also be important. I've talked about this interviewee bias. Try to avoid any gestures, and again, you may not know you're doing them, and that's why I say piloting is important. Practice this interview on a friend, or even just film yourself on your iPhone or whatever, using a camera to see what gestures you're making. Because if you are, raising your eyebrows, or if you are or using hand gestures to try and emphasise something, that could actually have some form of bias. So we need to be careful of that. Be natural, be objective. Posture and the tone of voice is important. Of course, if you're interviewing a manager in a business, don't slouch in your chair. Be professional. It's that it's really important. That and tone of voice, and it's just being professional about this. Really, it's not. I mean, this is common sense, to be honest. Avoid folding arms, sitting slightly inclined towards the interviewee. Just actually be attentive, make eye contact, show that you're interested in the project and you're interested in what they have to say. That's important. And believe me, I've seen many students saying, "Oh, I didn't feel they're interested." Well, and I actually hold them up and say, "Well, actually, the way you're approaching me now doesn't seem you're very interested. So how did you make them interested? So behavior, conduct, and posture, the way you deliver yourself, your stature and stuff like that can be important, and you've just got to be appropriate to the situation. Now, that's why I say piloting. Do this interview with a friend, see what they say, do it with a parent, do it with someone, so you get it right. Because last thing you want to be doing is getting an interview, setting up an interview, and the interviewee, basically the person you're interviewing, is going to give you one-word answers because they want to get rid of you. Not what we want. So if you're going to do interviews, okay, I want you to spend 5 or 10 minutes now just thinking, how am I going to prepare? And again, this is kind of stuff you can write down into your research methods section of your research project. How did you prepare? What things did you do? It will all go into the credit to your project. So because you've thought it through. Again, remember, we're assessing you on your ability in this research unit, or any of the research units that you're doing at Pearson, on your ability to manage yourself and to manage your own conduct. Now, one of those things is thinking things through. So if we can see that you're thinking things through, and you're avoiding any mistakes, and you're trying to avoid as much as possible, and you're trying to make it as professional as possible, then that's going to be in your favour. So it will help you with your marks. So spend 5 to 10 minutes now. Pause the session, and think about how you're going to prepare for the interviews that you may be wanting to conduct. Right, moving on. Questioning. So what type of questions? Obviously, you might have decided what kind of interview you need to do and why you're going to use that type of interviewing. What about the questions? Now, there's different types of questions. And remember, when you are writing the questions for your interview, or you're writing your themes that you want to ask about in a semi-structured interview, then why are you going to ask them? You need to justify why you're going to ask these questions. What would the data show us? What would be useful for this data? How is it going to help us with our research objective? How is it going to help us with our problem, opportunity, or issue that we're trying to pursue as part of this research project? So we've got these things called open questions. Open questions, dead easy. Basically, they are questions that are not yes and no, or they're closed questions, but they're questions where the interviewee is able to basically give a free response to it, and to give some insight and understanding to what's happening. So, for example, here's an example of a open question. Why did the organisation introduce its marketing strategy? Completely wide question. It's open, really open, and of course, whoever you're interviewing can then describe what happened and why it happened, and go through it in quite some depth. And that's what you want. That's really important. So, open questions are there to give them to allow people to give a free response. Another example: what methods have you used to make employees redundant? And they'll go through them. Another one here: how has the corporate strategy changed over the last 5 years? And again, the person you're interviewing can go into a lot more depth. They're not just saying one-word answers, or hopefully not. They're going to go and tell you for quite some time what it's about, and that's great because it gives you a real insight and depth to help you with your research project. If you are thinking about interviewing, then maybe this is the opportunity to start thinking about putting together some open questions that you could be using. Remember, very important, think about your research problem, your opportunity, and your issue, and think about the research objectives that you put together. Think about the questions you need to answer to help you with that research problem, opportunity, or issue, and also those research objectives. Very important, you always think back to that original aim that you're going for. Don't just conjure these things out because you're interested in them. Think, will this question I've put together, this open question I put together, help me with what I'm trying to achieve in terms of my research problem, opportunity, or issue? There's also, so that was open questions, but there's also something called probing questions. Now, a probing question is generally used in a semi-structured interview, and basically they spin off the back of a open question. So you've been putting together some open questions. So we've got an open question here. What external factors caused your strategy to change? And of course, the interviewee would go through those external factors. Fine, not a problem. But within that, when he or she is actually talking about those external factors, a probing question can be asked by the interviewer at any time. And they could say something, that's interesting, can you tell me more about this trend? Or can you tell me more about how you use this, or what you thought about that? Or how did that go down well in the factory? So you can direct the conversation through probing questions. So generally, these are definitely not used for structured interviews, okay? Because that's the standard questions. There's no flexibility there. But this is used in semi-structured interviews a lot, and you can remember that in semi-structured interviews and with unstructured interviews, you can pose questions as you feel fit in the interview process. In structured interviews, you have to have a list of questions, yeah, and you don't ask any more questions than that. But you've got more flexibility in the semi-structured and the unstructured interviews. So probing questions are to help you get more insight, because within the interview, they might say something that really fits with my problem, my opportunity, or my issue. So I'm going to ask them a bit more on that, and so you can say, well, can you tell me more about this? What happened here? Da da da. So it helps you direct them into a certain way, and helps you to get more information about what you want to understand. Closed questions, I hope you all know. This would definitely be used for the structured interviews. So closed questions where really they've only got several options to give you. How many people responded to the customer survey? 100. So there's a very clear-cut, short answer to that. Did you lose money or break even last year? We lost £20 million. Yes, we broke even. No, we made a profit of £6 million. So you can see that it's actually very objective, very closed. You can't really go there. It's not really explaining stuff. They're not allowing them to explain very much, which is fine, because it's like I say, for a structured interview, it's good because it helps you understand what the facts of the situation are. It's not helping you understand why they have broken even or they've lost money. It's just saying, have they? So, bear that in mind. Closed questions are a bit limiting like that, but it's great to find out the facts of the situation. You can use a mixture of closed questions, open questions, and probing questions within a semi-structured interview. So for example, closed questions, you can use them to understand the facts of the matter, and then use more open questions to get them to explain why something happened and what happened. So you could start off with, did you lose money or break even last year? They would say, we actually lost £20 million this year. The open question would be, why do you think you lost £20 million? What actually happened here? Can you tell me why you made such a loss? And they would go into it. So again, if you're thinking about interviews, you think about semi-structured interviews or any of the interview techniques, put together a number of closed questions you think would be very useful for your research. Okay, and again, think back to your research problem, opportunity, and issue, and try to justify why that closed question or those closed questions that you've put together, why it would be important to help you with your research project, and with actually giving recommendations to that problem, opportunity, or issue that you've defined at the very start of your research project. Moving on. Now remember that I said that if you are conducting interviews, you need to record them. Okay. When you are recording, especially for things like a semi-structured interview that you're going to interview someone, you need to have a full recording of that interview, and of course you can record that through a dictaphone. Again, say that you need a dictaphone. Say that you're going to record it through Skype or record it through the computer, whatever you're going to do. There's no problem interviewing someone over Skype. There's no problem interviewing someone over the telephone, as long as you can record it so you can get the data back and you can understand it and go over and over and over. You can make notes throughout the recording, but because you're actually recording it, it means that you can focus on asking the questions and understanding what's happening and the conversation, especially in things like an unstructured and semi-structured interview. When you are interviewing someone and you have completed the interview, you then make a full transcript. A transcript is where the interview is written up. bit by bit, word for word. Again, you can pay someone to do that, and if you wanted to, but it is because it is time consuming. But this transcript will go in the appendices. You have it in your research project, and then of course when you're analysing the information, and we'll come to this a bit later in the recordings, you can take out small paragraphs, or you can take out sentences that you feel are particularly useful for your research when you're analysing the transcript. So the transcripts generally go in the appendices, and when you're analysing the results, which is a separate recording in its own right, so you can listen to that later on, you will take out little sentences, paragraphs to help explain what's actually happening, or what or why it happened, or what their opinions are. Again, recordings are great because it allows you to concentrate on listening to them. Making notes, can be off-putting. It can also defocus you, especially in a semi-structured or an unstructured interview. You need to concentrate on the conversation because you might want to ask a lot more probing questions to understand what actually is going on. So recording, definitely. If you're doing writing, how you recorded it, did you do it over Skype? Where's the full recording? Make sure you transcribe it. And it's a must if you're doing interviews. So moving on to focus groups. Now remember that I said that a focus group is basically an interview, but it's a group interview. Okay, so it's a group interview where a topic is defined precisely, and there is a focus on enabling and recording interactive discussions between participants. Now, what we're doing here, the reason we use focus groups is because some of the topics we might be researching might involve groups. It might be, for example, a board of directors is a group of people that make decisions. So it would really lend itself to a focus group. Rather than singling out one board of director, we want to understand how they all think and how they think together. So a focus group would be more applicable. If we're researching maybe how Starbucks operates, we might want to interview all the staff that work on one shift and understand how they work together, understand how they think and talk about things. So it's a great way of getting some opinions from a wide range of people if they're working together or they're making decisions together. If we're talking about deciding on family holidays, well, we'd have a focus group with a family because that's how that works. Now, if Dad is saying a lot, maybe the interpretation of that is that Dad is making the big decisions for that family, for the family holiday. If the kids only say a little bit, obviously they have a minor say, but they may be saying something interesting. So the focus group is very useful when you are researching things where a group is involved. And they're also very useful if you're trying to get opinions as well on maybe products or services or whatever it may be, and you get a group of people that use those products and services together, so they can give you some feedback on it. So it is useful there. Again, the recommendation 6 to 8, I would recommend, probably a minimum of a kind of 3, a very maximum kind of 8. 8 is quite big actually. So somewhere between very minimum 3, but I'd probably go for about 4. 4 to 8 is about right, but that's what you probably need in your focus group. You have to be careful as well though, because when you do put the people together, some people won't contribute. Because they're shy, or maybe they're fearful. It could be that you've got a group of people, a group of employees, and then you've got 2 managers. Of course, the employees are going to be quite quiet because their managers are there, so they might not be able to free to speak. So it might be best to think about having a focus group with the employees, all at the kind of same level and pay grade, and then having all the managers all at the same level and pay grade and separating them out to have 2 focus groups going on. So thinking about how you organise these focus groups is important. You want to try and encourage everyone to contribute because you've selected people for a reason for a focus group, and you want to hear their voice, you want to hear what they think. So don't be afraid to interject, don't be afraid to actually probe people and say, what do you think, David? Or, what do other people think about this issue? What does everyone else think about John's suggestion? So you're encouraging people to have a debate, and when you're having this debate, this is where all the ideas and all the thinking comes out and all the discussion comes out, which is great for your research. Again, if you're going to use a focus group, why are you using a focus group? How will this help you with your research problem, opportunity, or issue? That's the key. You don't just do a focus group for the sake of doing a focus group because you think it's fun. It must be able to be useful. You've got to think of an argument why it is useful for your research topic, opportunity, or issue. And that's the important thing with any research method that you use, is why are you using this one? Why is this one most appropriate? Questions. The way you question the way you set up and question a focus group is very similar to a semi-structured interview or an unstructured interview. Try to use a lot of open questions for a focus group. You can quite by all means start off with closed questions. Maybe things like age, where they come from. Maybe things like what's their job title, what do they do at work, or something like that. And then move on to open questions. The more open questions, the better in a focus group, because you're trying to spur on discussion. That's what you're really interested in: how they think, how they come to conclusions. What is it about? So that's what we're trying to think about here. So open questions are much more really important. The location and settings is important. Again, be neutral. Don't do it in a manager's office or something like that. Beware of interruptions or being overheard. The layout of the seating, very straightforward. Have it in a circular fashion so everyone can discuss things with each other, or around a table's fine, not a problem. So focus groups can be used for a lot of things. You could put a product in front of them. If you've got an opportunity, one of your problem is that this company is losing sales left, right, and centre. Well, get a group of customers together, put them in a room, put them around a table, put the product that they've been buying or not buying anymore, as the case may be, and ask them and tell them what they think about it. If you're developing a new product and you've got a prototype, give them to them. Let them have a think about it. Let them have a look at it, play with it. Give them some feedback in a focus group, because they can discuss things together and think about the advantages, disadvantages. And the thing with a focus group, everyone spurs off each other, and that's where you get the detail, because some people don't think about the same things as everyone else, and that's why they're quite useful. So focus groups, dead straightforward. It's just an interview, like a semi-structured or in-depth or unstructured interview, but you're doing it with lots of people involved, and you're usually using it because what you're researching generally involves groups and how groups of people think or how they make decisions. So that's fine, not a problem. But it might not be appropriate to your research. It might be highly appropriate to your research. But what I want you to do now, if you want, is spend 5 to 10 minutes just thinking, why would I use a focus group, and is it appropriate to my research? And if it is, why? And if it isn't, why not? What else? Why is this research not appropriate? Remember, when you're writing your research method, always say why other research methods are appropriate, because it will help the examiner and the reader to think, right, yeah, the method you have chosen is the best method, because when you've gone through the others, it doesn't seem to fit. Those don't seem right. I can see your argument there. So you need to justify or not justify, de-justify why focus group is useful for your problem, opportunity, or issue. And that concludes our presentation today and recording on interviews and focus groups. I hope it's been useful. It's not rocket science. It is straightforward. There are slightly different types of interviews you need to be aware of. But the important thing is to be very clear on what you're trying to get out from an interview and why that will help you with your research problem opportunity. All these methods aren't complex at all, and it's selecting one and justifying why it's appropriate to your individual project, and the others aren't, and that's the key really. And obviously following some basic advice through the likes of these recordings, but also with every one of these recordings, please look at the relevant chapter in any good research methods textbook for undergraduate students. Every course that you're on at Pearson College, the research project course, will give you a textbook and recommend certain chapters from it. So just please refer to the chapter on interviews and focus groups for this one in the textbook that you've got, and then you'll be more than prepared to do an interview for your research project. Thank you for listening, and I hope it's been useful.